Welcome to Simulation Skills. This is the third course in the Futures Thinking specialization, and I'm really glad that you have joined us for more Futures Skills. I'm Jane McGonigal, your lead instructor for this course, but as always, you will get to hang out with and learn from all kinds of artists and researchers from here at the Institute. Now, what are simulation skills and why do they matter? Well, this course is based on one big idea. Human beings are the only living creatures with the ability to think about and plan for the far-off future, but even so, our brains do not make it easy. Over the past decade, scientists have discovered a number of neurological obstacles to thinking about the future effectively, and these glitches in the brain's behavior can lead us to make faulty assumptions about which futures are likely and which futures are unlikely. They make it hard for us to accurately predict how we individually will feel or what we individually might do in a particular future. And these glitches make us feel like we have less power to actually shape and influence the future than we really do. So this course and the simulation skills that you will learn in this course are all about overcoming these obstacles. You'll practice a number of techniques that have been studied by neuroscientists to help unstick your brain so you can think more creatively and strategically about the future. And you're also going to learn how to lead yourself and others through a method called first-person futures thinking, which has been shown in studies to increase motivation and hope for the future. As we do all of this, you'll be building not only your foresight skills and your creativity skills, but also your mental flexibility, which is your brain's ability to consider ideas and experiences that it has never encountered before in reality. And you're also going to expand your empathy, your ability to see the future from different points of view. And actually, in this course, the most important person that you'll be building empathy for is your future self, who is actually very different from your present self, and we're going to help you connect with that person. So, are you ready to start simulating? Let's try an experiment. When you think ahead 10 or 20 years in the future, what do you think can't be different? That there is just no way this thing will change. Maybe it's a certain cultural practice, maybe it's a law, maybe it's a technological limitation, a behavior, that when you look ahead to the far future, you have almost 100% confidence this thing will be the same in the future exactly as it is today. And you can feel free to say anything that pops into your mind. I mean, just what in your gut do you feel can't change? Maybe it's you are sure humans will still celebrate their birthdays and count their age in years, 10 years from now. Or maybe you are very sure that humans, for the most part, will walk on 2 feet. Or that if you look up in the sky on a clear day, the sky will still be blue, right? Any of these things, it seems reasonable to assume, can't change in the next decade. What can't be different in the future? This is actually a trick question, I'm sorry to say, because I have learned over the past decade as a futurist that the only way to really set yourself up for failure, the only way to ensure that you will be blindsided or shocked by whatever the future brings, is to hold in your mind with 100% confidence that things cannot change. And so one of the skills that we practice more than any other is unsticking our minds to list all of the things we are sure won't be different, and then force ourselves to try to find evidence that these things can and will change. Now, when I teach the course that you're taking here on Coursera at Stanford Continuing Studies, on the first day of class, I ask my students the same question I just asked you, And we played Stump the Futurist. So they just threw at me all of the things they are sure would not change in the next decade. And then I would take the next month to talk to my fellow researchers at the Institute for the Future, send out some queries, and try to come back on the last day of class with convincing evidence, with a plausible signal or driver that could show to them this thing you were sure wouldn't change. In fact, it could. And so what I'd like to do now is show you a few of the ideas that have come up in recent courses and how a futurist might try to push back and say, even that thing that seems so sure, that in fact could change. Let's take a look at these examples. One thing that surely can't be different in the future is something that has been true for all of human history, that it takes one man and one woman to make a baby. This is how we reproduce as a species. It's always been true. It will definitely be true for at least 10 years longer. Can we unstick our minds about this possibility? Well, you can find signals that suggest that this actually can change. A year ago, the first 3-parent baby was born using a new experimental method that's legal only in a few places in the world, including in the United Kingdom, where this happened. This technique is called pronuclear transfer, and it combines the genetic material of 2 women and 1 man to make 1 baby, and it's being used today primarily to help parents avoid passing on genetic diseases. So there you go, 3 parents to make 1 baby. And so we don't even need to go 10 years in the future to see that this is already technologically possible to be changed. Looking for other signals in this space, I recently found research from Cambridge University that suggests they believe they will be able to create embryos from genetic material from same-sex parents so that 2 men or 2 women could have a baby together. This is being worked on and pioneered as we speak. And taking it even one step further, researchers in China are working on creating babies from scratch, from no egg, no sperm, and no womb, just cultivating artificial wombs and embryos from the skin cells of one person to create new life. So all of these fertility techniques are suggesting that, in fact, a man and a woman make a baby can and almost certainly will be changed over the next decade. But here's something that surely cannot be different in the near future, that every 24 hours, the sun sets in the west, right? That's a law of nature. It's the law of the universe. Sun comes up, sun goes down, rises in the east, sets in the west. We can safely anticipate that that will remain true for the next decade or 2. But if we go looking for signals of what might change for the next generation of people on Earth, one of the things that we're seeing might change is the nature of sunset, of how often a sunset occurs. And what you're looking at here is actually an image of sunset not on Earth, but on Mars. And it turns out that on Mars, they have a slightly longer day than we do on Earth, so it actually takes a few hours longer for the sun to set. So maybe the sun still sets in the west, but it takes more than 24 hours, and we can start to imagine life on Mars with fewer sunsets. Why would we imagine life on Mars? Well, the signals are everywhere. Lots of technologists and venture capitalists are investing in missions to explore and colonize space. Elon Musk, for example, has set his personal goal as getting 1 million people on Mars in the next 40 years. He personally wants to invent the technology and bankroll these efforts. And Mars is definitely a place where things can be different, not just sunsets, but new ways of governing, new ways of organizing society, new ways of growing food. And so just even questioning something as simple as does the sun set in the west every 24 hours starts to open up a lot of different possibilities. One more, which I have to say, when my student threw this at me, I was very stumped. I mean, it is really hard to refute this one. My student suggested that in the next decade, 2 + 2 will still equal 4. We are not going to change the immutable laws of math and numbers. So I had to dig around and see, is there any way that this would not be true? Because as a futurist, this is actually kind of the most fun thing we get to do. We really enjoy and geek out on proving that literally anything can change. And here's an area of research that I stumbled upon. The Semiconductor Industry Association issued a report last year sounding an alarm that we do not have enough energy to fuel all of the computation that we will be doing as a society in the future, that we are using so much technology and creating so much computational infrastructure that we literally do not have the gas, the fuel, the electricity, the power to make it all work. And they had an interesting solution. They said, if we want to be able to fuel our technology in the future, we need to invest more in quantum computing because quantum computing is more energy efficient. Which means that it can, instead of just running one computation on the same amount of energy, it can run two. And then you amplify that by 2, by 2, by 2, by 2. So in a future of quantum computing that we must adapt to in order to fuel all of our computers, 2 plus 2 will not equal 4. Now, what all of these examples have in common is underlying them the rule that it is incredibly important to practice unsticking your mind. As a futurist, there is no truth or assumption that you can cling to that cannot possibly be changed one day. And it's very important that you practice techniques and habits that make it easier for your brain to flex and adapt and change. And what we're going to do this week in the simulation course is teach you 3 really powerful techniques that you can practice anytime, anywhere, while you're walking, while you're in the shower, while you're falling asleep at night. These are the foundational tools that will allow you to build the neurological pathways that make it easier for you to see change and accept that anything can be different. Where are you right now? Are you at home watching this video? Are you on a bus watching this video? Are you at work watching this video? Take a second, look around, ground yourself in reality, because in a moment, I'm going to ask you to change this reality in your imagination. And here's what I want you to imagine. I want you to imagine that the first thing you did when you woke up this morning was to pack a bag. You packed a bag, a backpack, a suitcase, and you decided to go somewhere. Get out of town. Where would you have gone if you had made that decision this morning? Where would you have wanted to go? Where could you have gone? Where do you have the resources to go? And I want you to take this question seriously and allow yourself to roll back time and imagine you've given yourself permission this morning to pack a bag and go somewhere. Where did this alternate version of you go? And when you have a specific example to this question, a specific answer to this question, I want you to picture it as if you had made this decision. You can close your eyes and picture, where are you now in this alternate version of reality? You went to that place with your bag packed. Where are you? When you can answer that question and picture it in your mind as if it had actually happened, then you have successfully completed this technique. And what you just did is something we call predicting the past. And the way it works is you think about a decision that you made in the past, a real choice that you made, and then you imagine that you had made a different choice, and you think about what the consequences of that different choice might be. And you can do this for little things like, what if I had gotten dressed in something different this morning? You can do it for big things like, what if I hadn't moved away from my hometown? What if I were still living where I grew up? Or what if I had taken or I had turned down that work opportunity that seemed really important at the time? This technique is focused on the past, but it's incredibly useful for futurists because it helps us see that the present didn't have to be exactly the way it is, that we made choices in the past that affected how the present turned out. And if the present could be different because of choices we made, then the future can still be different because of choices that we make. And it's not just futurists who use this technique, it's actually very popular in the treatment of depression. It turns out to be a really helpful intervention because one of the main symptoms of depression is believing that nothing that you do matters, that you can't change your current circumstances. But when you practice thinking about how you could have made choices that would have changed your present, it helps you imagine how you could make choices in the present that would change your future. So this is the predicting the past technique. Now you know how to use it. In the next video, we're going to do the opposite. Instead of predicting the past, we're going to remember the future. Let's try another technique for unsticking the mind. This time, you're going to try to imagine yourself doing something that you have never done before, and hopefully something you've never even considered doing until right this very moment. And the way that you're going to come up with this previously unimaginable thing is using the XYZ method, and here's how it works. X is something you love to do. It could be anything. It could be baking cookies. It could be singing along to your favorite song. It could be reading a good book or doing cartwheels. Whatever you love to do, pick one thing, and that will be your X. So do you have an X in mind? I want you to pause until you have chosen an X. You have your X? Okay. Y is a person you care about, and it can be anyone at all, as long as it's someone you actually know, you have a relationship with them. Don't pick a celebrity like Beyonce unless you know Beyonce. Pick someone you know, and this person needs to be living, still alive. Okay, so anybody that you care about, still alive, someone you know, pick your Y. And you have your Y? Okay. Now we're going to choose a Z. And a Z is a favorite place in the world, but maybe somewhere you don't get to go to all the time. Maybe it's a place you took a trip to once, or a place that you used to go to often when you lived there, but you don't get to go there very much anymore. So some place that's a little bit out of your everyday routine. Think of that place. It could be a cafe, it could be a park, it could be a street corner, it could be somebody's house. Do you have a favorite place in mind? Okay. Now what you're going to do is you are going to imagine yourself doing that thing you love, your X, with that person you care about, your Y, in that favorite place that you don't get to go to as often as you used to, your Z. Okay, and I want you to picture this combination as vividly as you can, as if it were a memory that you had. It already happened, you're thinking back to this amazing experience you had doing X with Y and Z. And just in case you actually have done X with Y and Z, you've randomly called up an experience you've had, change one of them so that it's a combination you've never done before. And when you can picture this so vividly that it's like a memory, like a movie playing out in your mind, then you have successfully completed this technique. This technique that you just practiced is called remembering the future. And the way it works is that you combine some things you already have a real life experience with, so you can conjure up some real experiences and details, but you combine them in really unfamiliar ways so that you're forcing your brain to take a kind of leap of faith to simulate what it might be like. And you get bonus points. It works more effectively if you can come up with a plausible explanation for how you wound up doing X with Y in Z. What turn of events led you to be with this person doing this thing in this place? If you can come up with a logical, rational explanation, then this technique works even better. And the funny thing about this technique is that even though it can be hard to come up with a rational explanation for this really randomly generated event, every time you imagine yourself doing something you've never done before, your brain actually starts to believe that it's more likely to happen in the future. You rate this possibility as more probable. And the reason why this happens is that when your brain tries to imagine something it doesn't have a lot of experience with, it kind of calculates how hard it is to imagine. If it's really hard to imagine, your brain says, that's probably not very likely. I just can't picture it. Have you ever said that? That's what's happening. When you think something is unlikely, you literally can't picture it in your brain. But every time you imagine something that's never happened, you start to build a memory in your brain. That picture that you're conjuring up through your active imagination makes it easier for your brain to imagine it next time. And when you imagine it again, it gets easier to imagine. And the more times you visualize it, the easier it is for your brain to say, you know what? I definitely think that could happen. And when you know how this technique works, you can use it for really powerful effects. For example, one of my colleagues here at the Institute for the Future, who you've already met, Tessa Finlev, she does work in regions of conflict to help people stay engaged with the difficult process of making peace. And one of the things that you'll have people do is imagine solutions 10 years in the future, what their daily lives are like when a more peaceful situation has emerged. And this is helpful in keeping people engaged with the very important but sometimes difficult to believe in goal of achieving peace. Another colleague of mine works with children in refugee camps, and he leads them through a process of imagining what their future might be like when they are 10 years from now living in completely different circumstances, better circumstances. And he's found that this is a really important way to maintain hope and optimism in incredibly stressful conditions, because if you can imagine and believe that things can be different in the future, it allows you to maintain hope for today. So you've now learned the technique of remembering the future as if it had already happened. You are ready for the third and final technique to help you unstick your mind about what's possible, and you will learn that final technique in the next video. Now let's practice one final technique for unsticking your mind. This time, you're going to try to imagine yourself experiencing something that is so different from anything you've ever experienced, so unrelatable that it's almost impossible to imagine. And the best way that I know to practice this technique is to go on any news site and look for a news story about somebody who is experiencing a situation or a problem that I have never experienced, that is very far removed from my current reality. So for example, I recently read a news story about two young sisters living in a rural village in India. And in the village that they live in, there is a custom that when young women want to go into a nearby village or a bigger city, they need to enlist some of their male relatives or neighbors to come with them. And that when they are actually physically in the environment of that nearby village or city, the men will create a kind of human chain around the girls, that they will use their arms and hands to create a circle, link up around the girls so that They can avoid any unwanted contact, physically or communication with strangers. That's the custom. They protect the girls physically from interaction with people they don't know. Now, this is a tradition that I've never personally experienced, and it does seem very far removed from my reality. So this is a really good example of a situation to practice this technique with. And I want you to try to imagine yourself living with this kind of tradition. Now, the way this technique works is you don't imagine that you're somebody else. So I don't want you to imagine that you are a young girl in a rural Indian village. Instead, I want you to picture this experience in your own life. So can you imagine where you live now if this became a custom, if this became a tradition or norm, that wherever you went, you were expected to enlist relatives or neighbors to come with you to protect you. Whenever you went to a context where you would possibly be surrounded by strangers, maybe you can take the gender component out of it, maybe you want to keep it in, but just imagine that you cannot travel alone. You must always bring a neighbor or stranger with you. And I want you to try to picture this. Imagine what your schedule might be like over the next day or week or month. Who are you bringing with you? How do you convince them to come? Who's asking you to go with them someplace? And try to imagine what it would be like to live in this reality and how it would change your daily life. If you can spend a minute considering it, and this technique's a little bit harder than predicting the past or remembering the future. It takes an even bigger leap of imagination. But I want to give yourself permission to press pause on the video and try to let this play out in your mind. And when you're done imagining this alternate reality for yourself, press play again and I'll explain to you what this technique is and how it works. The skill that you just practiced is called hard empathy. Now, it turns out there are actually two kinds of empathy, although we don't always recognize the difference. The first kind of empathy, easy empathy, or it's often called emotional empathy, it's what happens when we can definitely directly relate to what someone else is going through. Maybe you see a child celebrating their birthday and you can conjure up memories of your own birthdays when you were a child and how happy you were to get that cake or open those presents. When you see somebody else experiencing something you've experienced yourself, your body calls up the feelings. Your brain replays them. You can actually have a direct firsthand experience, a kind of vicarious emotion. And that's the easy kind of empathy. When we have had our own experiences, it doesn't take a leap of imagination. Our brain and body make that connection very easily for us. It's just very easy and natural for us to relate in that way. But the other kind of empathy, hard empathy, or what is often called cognitive empathy, because it requires more active cognition, more active thinking to achieve. That's the kind of empathy that we actually have to work to experience. Our brain doesn't have any direct memories. Our body can't call in any feelings that we've personally experienced because we've never been through that situation. So we have to use a combination of intuition and rational thinking to try to figure out how would we feel? What would we do if we were in that situation? And it's not always perfect. I mean, we're not always right. We don't always accurately feel what someone else is feeling. But we can, through practice, get better at understanding someone else's experience by putting ourselves in their shoes and by activating this kind of hard empathy. And this technique is really, really important for unsticking your mind about what's possible, because when you can imagine yourself experiencing a reality that you've never experienced, but that other people are experiencing right now, you really improve your ability to believe that things can be different, because they are already different for other people. And when you can recognize that and when you can feel that, it becomes much easier to imagine how things might be different for yourself in the future. So there you have the 3 techniques for unsticking the mind: predict the past, remember the future, and practice hard empathy. In the next video, we're just going to do a quick peek behind the scenes, look at what's happening in the brain when you practice these 3 techniques and the really interesting patterns of neurological pathways they build that will make you incredibly good at thinking about the future. Now that you've practiced the 3 techniques for unsticking your mind, let's actually look at the brain and take advantage of fMRI technology, functional magnetic resonance imaging technology, to see what is happening in your brain when you unstick it. Which parts of the brain are activated, and why are they activated by these techniques, and how will that help you think more effectively about the future? So I'm going to show you some of the brain imaging and talk to you about the different regions and what they do. And what you can see here, first of all, is what it looks like when we compare neurological activation during the predicting the past technique versus remembering the future technique. You can see here all the different regions that are circled. We see activation in the same patterns in the same regions. So we know that these 2 techniques, even though in one you're thinking about the past and in one you're thinking about the future, they actually activate the same regions. Which regions are they? The first is an area of the brain that's associated with memory and simulation. You can think about this as essentially being like the movie in your mind or the virtual reality in your mind. So this is the part of the brain that is responsible for your ability to see something as if it were in front of you, even though it's not. There is a small percentage of the population actually who can't do this. About 1% of people, when they try to picture something in their mind, it just draws a blank. So if you're one of those people, you might not literally be seeing an image or literally viewing a movie playing. You might be thinking about it more abstractly. But for 99% of people, it does have a very strong visual and spatial quality. So this part of the brain fires up when you're predicting the past or you're remembering the future, because you have to construct the scene. You have to try to see it, to believe it. The second part of the brain that's really active during these 2 techniques is mentalizing. The mentalizing part of the brain is what allows you to figure out what other people might do in a particular situation. This is where you project yourself into other people's shoes, because it's not just your own actions or feelings that you have to be able to predict successfully in order to picture an alternate reality. You have to figure out what other people would think or do or feel in that reality, and that allows you to create a more believable or plausible scenario in your mind. And the third activity that's happening in your brain in both remembering the future and predicting the past is a region that's responsible for something called performance monitoring. Performance monitoring is how you are constantly evaluating the situation you're in for opportunities to take action that will get you closer to a goal that you have, whether it's getting some food because you're hungry, you're looking for a partner to mate with because you don't have one. Whatever your highest goals are, you're constantly scanning the environment. You're always aware, oh wait, that's something that could help me achieve a goal. And this part of the brain fires up when you are trying to predict the past or remember the future, because it's actually the best way to predict what you might do. When you're conscious of what your highest goals are, those are the goals that are going to drive your actions. So this is a way of being really good at predicting your own future behavior. So you have these 3 parts all fired up. It's the movie or the virtual reality in your mind that's seeing it and bringing it to 3D life. It's the part of your brain figuring out what other people would do and feel, and the part of your brain that helps you figure out what you would think and feel and do. And all 3 of these work in combination to create an incredibly powerful simulation. And it's really interesting that it does this for both thinking about the past and thinking about the future. When researchers first realized this, when the scientists started first producing the imagery that you were just looking at, there were a lot of headlines, like in Discover magazine, there was a big cover story that remembering the past is like imagining the future. And we were seeing in Science News witty headlines like, thanks for the future memories, because to the brain, remembering the past and visualizing the future looks surprisingly familiar. And at first, futurists were freaking out about this because we thought, wait a minute, if imagining the future is like thinking about the past, how will we ever be able to think about the future in ways that don't mirror our past? How will we be able to anticipate possibilities we have no direct experience with, how we'll be able to imagine realities that have never happened before. And at first, this seemed almost like a neurological curse. But that's where these two techniques come so much in handy, because they're not about remembering the past as it was. They're about predicting how the past could have been different. And by improving our brain's ability to imagine pasts that never happened, we can use those same neurological pathways to imagine futures that have never happened. So this is why it's incredibly important not just to remember what you've experienced, but to remember things you've never experienced. And you can find intuitions about this in research before we had brain imaging technology. In fact, going way back to 1986, there was a really seminal textbook on motivation and cognition that examined this kind of thinking, which in the research literature is called counterfactual thinking. It's thinking about things that are counter to the facts of reality, things that never happened, and imagining them as if they could have happened or will happen. And I just want to share with you something from this text, because it really speaks to how we think as futurists. They write, "The generation of past counterfactuals gives us greater flexibility in thinking about possible futures." Why? Because without considering alternatives to reality, we must accept the past as having been inevitable, and therefore the future will be inevitable. It too can only turn out one way. So here we have really closely linked two of these unsticking habits: predicting the past, remembering the future. And it actually wasn't until a few years later that researchers discovered the third technique activates exactly the same neurological pathways, that hard empathy calls on all of the regions and processes that predicting the past and remembering the future does. And when you think about this, this makes sense, because hard empathy is a counterfactual also. It runs counter to the facts of your own life as you have personally experienced it. So hard empathy becomes part of this kind of magic triangle of simulation, which is how I refer to it. This magic triangle of simulation allows you to teach your brain how to see things it has never seen before, how to believe in things as being possible that it has no firsthand or direct experience of. So this magical triangle of simulation, these are 3 techniques you can practice anytime, any place. They're especially useful right before you're starting to do a forecasting project or you're starting to look for signals. They just warm up the pathways in your brain that will allow you to be more flexible and creative in your thinking. And I just want to say, if as you're practicing these, you find it hard, that you try to call these possibilities to mind and nothing comes, that it's blank and it's kind of painful or frustrating, this is normal, right? This is a skill that you have to acquire, because the default in the brain is to see what it has already seen and to believe what it has already experienced. So it's okay that this is hard, and it's okay that it can be frustrating. I would like to summon the wise words of Kevin Kelly, one of our greatest futurists, one of the founders of Wired magazine. And he says, "We cannot expand our self and our collective self without making holes in our heart. When we're thinking about the future, we are stretching our boundaries. It can be painful. Of course, there will be rips and tears. When we imagine a better future, we should factor in this constant discomfort." And I love these wise words, because trying to see things that we haven't seen before, it is painful, it is hard. We're tearing at the boundaries of our mind. And I hope that as you practice these techniques, that you find yourself getting more comfortable with this process, and that you're beginning not to tear at the boundaries, but to stretch and flex them. And this will improve your creativity and your belief that you can change the future and that the future can be different. As futurists, which you're becoming one of by taking this course, we spend a lot of time thinking about what the world might be like 10 years in the future. Today, we're going to start by imagining what we personally might be like 10 years in the future. So it's time for another little thought experiment. I want you to imagine who you might be 10 years from now. So take your age, add 10 years. I'm 41, so I'm imagining 51-year-old version of myself. And I want you to try to think of 3 ways that this 10-year-old version of yourself might be different from who you are today. And I will walk you through this. So for the first way that you might be different 10 years in the future, I want you to think of a way you might be physically different. Okay? So one change in your body 10 years from now. Maybe it's a change you feel good about. Maybe it's a change you're not looking forward to. Whatever it is, just try to sit with that possible reality for a moment. And remember, it's the future. You can always change it if you don't like it. Okay, do you have one physical difference in mind? Okay. For the second difference, I want you to try to imagine a difference in your home life. Maybe it's a difference in who you live with. Maybe you have kids who you think 10 years from now won't be living at home, or maybe you think you might live in a different city or part of the world 10 years in the future. Maybe you plan to move in with someone. Can you picture one possible, plausible change for your home life 10 years in the future? I have one in mind. Okay, for the third difference, I would like you to try to imagine one way this future version of you might be better or stronger or smarter in some way. Maybe you've taken a bunch of classes on Coursera and you are an expert in something that you aren't an expert in today. Maybe you've adopted a new hobby and you've gotten really good at something. Maybe you've gone through an experience that you wouldn't have wished for, but it made you a survivor and stronger in some way. So can you think of one way that future you is stronger, smarter, better? Be specific. Okay, so whoever this version of yourself that you just imagined, I can tell you with near certainty one thing about this person. Unless your brain works differently from 99.99999% of human beings, this person who you just imagined is a stranger to you. And this is not just some kind of poetic metaphor. This is a neurological fact. When you think about yourself 10 years in the future, your brain treats the person that you're thinking about as someone you've never met, and maybe someone that you think you would really not like. And let me explain how this works. Usually when you think about yourself, a part of the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex fires up. And this part of the brain is really important to how you tell the story of who you are and how you know who you are. When you wake up every morning and you know you are that person. Every morning I wake up, I'm Jay McGonigal. I know my life story. I know my goals for the future. This coherent sense of yourself, it's really tied into the medial prefrontal cortex. And when you encounter information that seems like it's really important to that sense of self and to your goals for the future, this part of the brain fires up. It's like, oh, that's related to me. I really care. And you pay more attention to it and you really care about it. When you are talking to or thinking about people that you don't know very well, maybe it's the first time you're meeting someone, this part of the brain powers down. It says, I don't know this person is not relevant to my life, not important, turns it off. When you are interacting with or thinking about somebody that you believe is very different from yourself, someone with different values or different experiences or different interests that they're pursuing, this part of the brain powers down even more. When you think about your far future self and this part of the brain starts to power down, and it actually powers down to the same level of people you've never met or people you feel like you have nothing in common with, what this creates is a situation where your brain essentially has no empathy for your future self. And this has all kinds of consequences because when we make decisions, we tend to favor our present self over our future self. And it's why we tend to get into these ridiculous battles with ourselves. You know, future self wants to be really fit, but present self wants to sit on the couch and watch Netflix. Who am I going to make a decision in favor of? Well, if I don't relate to my future self, if I feel like that person is a stranger, then I'm going to make the decision that makes my present self happy instead of my future self. Or if I'm trying to save money for the future, putting money away for retirement, because retirement is so far off for most people, that feels like we're handing money over to a stranger on the street. Who would want to hand money over to a stranger on the street? Retirement doesn't feel like it's saving for ourselves. It feels like it's saving for someone we've never met and don't care about at all. So this weird glitch in the brain, it has all kinds of meaningful consequences for our real lives. And it has consequences for society too, because if we think about our future selves as people we don't like and don't know, we might make decisions as companies or organizations that benefit our present selves at the cost of the future, whether that's not acting on issues like climate change or building technologies that actually have terrible consequences and we scale them to 1 billion people without thinking about how they might affect the future. We all know the famous Facebook mantra, move fast and break things. Well, who's going to have to clean up the things that we break? Our future selves, but we don't know them and we don't like them. So we make the decisions that improve our companies today. Now, what's interesting is that the medial prefrontal cortex, it does operate a little differently depending on your orientation towards the future. There are some people, when they think about next weekend, it seems really far away. If I were to ask you, what are you doing next weekend? They'd say, oh my gosh, it's like 1,000,000 years away. Who knows? And when they try to picture themselves next weekend, the medial prefrontal cortex powers down. To that person, their future self next weekend is already a stranger. That's a bit of an extreme example. For most people, we could imagine a few weeks, a few months, even a year out, and we could say, oh, me this time next year, I still relate to that person. I understand and know that person. And actually, for most people, the medial prefrontal cortex will stay engaged for 1, 2, or even 3 years. Most people, it starts to power down at 5. It's only an extreme future-oriented percentage of the public that can really stay connected and empathetic with a future self 10 years out or longer. But it turns out there are techniques you can use to change how the medial prefrontal cortex responds to images of the future and to thinking about yourself in the future. And that's what the rest of this course is about. How do you improve your brain's ability when it thinks about the future to say that future affects me and I can relate to it? And so not only do you build empathy for your future self, but you actually start to make better predictions about who you will be in that future, what problems you can solve, and what actions you can take. So it prepares you to be somebody who can be successful when that future rolls around. And in the next video, we are going to start practicing one of those techniques for building empathy for your future self. There are 2 ways to think about any future forecast. You can think about it in facts, or you can think about it in first person. And only by thinking about it in first person can you build empathy for your future self. So I'm going to walk you through an example of thinking about a specific forecast in fact versus thinking about it in first person, and then you're going to have a chance to try it for yourself. So here's one way to think about a future forecast, a forecast about climate change. In facts, we might say, by the year 2050, we expect that sea levels may rise by as much as 9 feet, and that 750 million people may be displaced from where they're living currently. These are all possible facts about the future. They describe the world we might live in. Thinking about a future in facts, it simply sets the scene. It simply describes the world, but it doesn't necessarily allow us to put ourselves into that reality. if you want to think about the future in first person, you have to start to look at those facts from your own point of view, from your own values, from your own daily life, from your goals for your own future. So let me take a look at that same forecast, but from a personal point of view. By the year 2050, I personally will be 72 years old. And already this is starting to shift my thoughts about climate change, because if I'm being honest, when I normally think about climate change, I'm still thinking about the me I know today. I'm projecting Jane McGonigal at my age with my physical abilities and my family situation into a world of climate change. But right away, when I start to think about the future in first person, I'm realizing that when climate change is really in its fullest bloom in 2050, I'm going to be a senior version of myself with different physical and cognitive abilities, a different number of people in my family, I probably won't be working. So suddenly I'm thinking about climate change from a very different point of view. I might pull up a map of climate change and look specifically at the region that I think I'll be living in, which is the region I'm living in today, the San Francisco Bay Area. When I look at this map, the first thing that comes to notice for me is that both of the airports that I use today are projected to be completely underwater. So I can start to think of a place that I go to often, a space that I inhabit today, and I have to force myself to imagine that these places literally will not exist, that the ocean will cover these halls that I walk through, these lots that I park in. So I force myself to imagine something I know very well becoming different. And then the next thing that I can do is start to process this in relationship to my goals. So if I'm going to be 72, maybe we'll have grandchildren at this age. I already have children, so I'm halfway there. And now I'm thinking about, where am I going to live? What if my kids don't live in the San Francisco Bay Area? What if I want to spend time with my grandkids? Either I'm going to be living in virtual reality with them, and maybe that's how I will adapt to climate change, or maybe I will want to live closer to them, because as I start to investigate the airports of the future and climate change, everything that I'm seeing as I start to look for signals of this future are that planes won't be as reliable in the future, that extreme weather will prevent takeoff, that there's going to be a lot more turbulence, so nobody's going to want to be flying. And suddenly, as I think about my future, I'm thinking I will want to live near my family members, wherever that might be. This is all just a very personal way of starting to process some very abstract scientific facts or future projections about the world. And this is how we start to think in first person about the future. It just changes which regions of our brains are activated, and it allows us to care more about that future because we can see ourselves living in it and dealing with it. First person future thinking is really like building a virtual reality simulator in your mind. And just like virtual reality technology, the first virtual reality systems, they were cool, but they didn't look that realistic. They didn't feel that immersive. And over generations of technology developing, the pictures got crisper, the colors more vivid, the reality more believable. The more you practice first-person futurist thinking, and the more you practice it around a specific forecast or scenario, the more vivid the details get, the crisper the picture, the more believable the immersion. And so this is a skill you practice, and it is a skill that evolves as your brain gets better at simulating what your life might be like in this future. And I do want to say that one of the best ways to improve the vividness of this virtual reality simulation, to improve the crispness and clarity and believability of this future, is to keep collecting signals about this future and to keep studying and analyzing drivers of this future. These are skills that you learned in the first two courses in the specialization. How do you imagine something vividly and realistically? You have to give your brain something to latch onto, and that's where these signals and drivers that you've been collecting and analyzing come in handy. You don't want your imagination to just run wild. You want it to be anchored in real evidence and plausible possibilities. So that's what first-person futures thinking is all about and how you can get better at it. And of course, the best way to get better at something is to try it yourself. So in the next video, you are going to go on a first-person futures trip to a very, very strange future, one that many people think is a crazy idea, but it's a future that I happen to know people are building today. So I will see you in that future. Time to go on a trip to the future. I'm going to do a quick forecast for you using some signals that I find really interesting from the world of politics and voting. And then we're going to first person you into that forecast. So here we go. The first signal is results of a national survey in the United States conducted in April 2018. The survey found that 35% of all United States workers would give up the right to vote in all elections for the rest of their life in return for a 10% salary raise from their current employer. To me, this is an interesting signal that some people would be willing to give up the right to vote. I am going to file that away and keep looking for other signals. This is a project called the Global Vote, and it is intended as a demonstration of what I think is a very powerful argument, which is that the elections in one country have consequences for many other countries, and that it actually matters to people all over the world who gets elected president of Germany or the United States or South Korea. This project offers any actual candidate who's actually running for national office the opportunity to come to this website and explain their global platform. If you are elected president of the country that you are running in, what would your position be on matters of global importance? And it's essentially asking them to argue why people from other countries should vote for them if they had the right to vote in some other country's election. So this is not a valid place where you can actually vote in other people's countries, but it does offer you the opportunity to cast a symbolic vote. So I can go onto this website today on the Global Vote and look at all of the national elections happening around the world and cast a symbolic vote so that we can say the people of Iran voted this way in the election in Canada and kind of learn something. So this is an interesting signal to me because I think it suggests possible growing interest in allowing a global community to vote in matters of global importance. The next signal is really a bunch of signals. There are so many new startups and research projects looking at how blockchain technology could be used to create more secure elections so that individuals could have a more secure record of seeing that their vote was correctly counted and cast and that it actually was a part of the final results. And so lots of people are innovating with using blockchain in democratic voting. And one of them is followmyvote.com. So if you're interested in seeing an example of this, you could check out Follow My Vote, but there are many, many versions of this signal. So I take these signals into account, kind of combine them like we would combine jelly beans into a flavor recipe. And here's a forecast that I would like to propose seems plausible to me. And I will preface this by saying I did talk to a leading blockchain expert to find out, is this technologically feasible? And I got a thumbs up. So it's technologically feasible. Do we think it would be politically feasible? Well, let's see. Here's the future in facts. One fact is that millions of votes go unused in any election. In the United States, nearly half of our eligible voters don't actually cast a vote, and we see this to varying degrees around the world in free and open elections, that some people just don't care to use their vote. Combine this with the fact that smart contract technology could be used to set up contracts in which blocks of voters might trade their votes in one election in order to have access to other countries' elections, and that these could be traded like a kind of currency on a blockchain market like cryptocurrencies. You could wind up with a platform in which voters pool unused votes and gain access to cast real votes in other countries' elections. So imagine yourself in this future. Imagine that there's a platform called BlockVote. It is a blockchain-powered, smart contract-empowered voting platform. You are participating in it. You have gained access to a pool of votes in some other country's election. It's the year 2030. You are on your phone or your smartwatch or your augmented reality system, whatever you're using to cast a vote, have it be vivid in your mind, and you are about to cast a vote in some other country's election for the first time. In order to put yourself in this first-person future, I want you to decide in your mind which country's elections you're voting in. I'm going to imagine that I'm voting in South Korea's elections. Pick one for yourself, any country that you have an interest in. And I want you to imagine it as if it had already happened. This is our remembering the future technique. Imagine what app you're using or what device you're using, and then see how you feel. And you will have successfully completed this first-person future when you can answer 3 questions. What country's election are you voting in? What app or device are you using to cast your vote? And what one word would you use to characterize the emotion that you're feeling? We'll put up a discussion board so you can share your answer to this question. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you say. First-person future thinking doesn't just improve the amount of empathy that you have for your future self. It actually has been shown to increase your creativity when it comes to thinking about the future. That when you can project yourself into a specific forecast, and then you're asked to come up with ideas for actions that somebody might take in that future, or other events that might unfold as a result, as a consequence of that forecast, you come up with more varied and more diverse ideas for actions or consequences that then, when they're compared with other people's ideas, they're rated as more original and surprising. And this is really interesting because it speaks to one of the reasons why it's so important to do a kind of first-person simulation when we think about the future, because we think about the future in order to figure out how we want to make things different. And if we want to innovate, or we want to invent or make a change, the more creativity we can bring to bear on that thought process, the better. But you might be wondering, how exactly do we know that some of these future thinking methods improve creativity? Because it's not just first-person future thinking, it's also predicting the past, remembering the future, hard empathy. Those techniques have also been measured to increase creativity too. And I think if you understand the way that scientists often measure creativity, it will help you understand the next technique we're going to use to improve our ability to simulate the future. So here is how scientists usually measure creativity. It has to do with bricks, which seems like a very strange way to measure something as magical as creativity. But when scientists run a study and they want to see, did we make someone more creative, or did we make this group collectively more creative, they will ask the people in the study a really simple question. They will ask them to list as many uses for a brick as they can think of. And you have a set amount of time, 1 minute, 5 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour. If you're in a group, can be really fun to think of how many different ways you could use a brick. And go ahead and give yourself a chance, maybe press pause on the video and see, if you can think of 5 different uses for a brick. And when you're done, press play again and we'll talk about what you thought of. So here we are, you just thought about uses for a brick, and if you're like most people, the ideas that came to mind first were things like, I could build a house, or I could use it as a heavy weight to hold something down, or maybe I could use it as a weapon to hit someone, or maybe you thought that you could heat it up and use it as a way to cook something or to create warmth. And these are some very common ideas for how to use a brick. And if you had an hour, you could probably stretch your mind and come up with some weirder ones, and maybe you already did. But When scientists are trying to measure creativity, what they'll do is they'll take your list and then they'll run it in a computer against all the things other people have thought of. And they're always very interested in outlier ideas. And they can code ideas to see like, wow, nobody's ever suggested we use a brick for that before. And you'd be considered a highly original and creative thinker. If you have a lot of weird ideas for what to do with something, it's considered highly divergent thinking. Your thinking diverges from other people. But it turns out that just asking people what they would do with a brick is not a really great way to unleash creativity. We tend to come back to the same answers. There is one way that you can get somebody to have really original ideas, maybe ideas that the scientists and coders have never seen before, and we will do that technique together right now. So I'd like you to think of something that you feel like you know more about or care more about, something you are more passionate about than most of the people taking this class on Coursera. It could be anything at all. It could be brewing your own beer. It could be running marathons. It could be investigating twins and what they have in common and don't have in common. Literally anything at all. So I'd like you to pick something that you are really passionate about and you think you know more about and care more about than pretty much anyone taking this class. Do you have an answer in mind? I, of course, will pick game design since I am quite passionate about game design for mine. Okay, now what you're going to do is you're going to take a minute to try to think of 5 uses for a brick, but I want you to think of 5 uses for a brick in the context of that thing that you know a lot about or care a lot about. So in my case, I'm going to try to think of 5 games that I could design with a brick. Are you ready to think of your 5 uses for a brick in the domain of the thing you care a lot about or know a lot about? I'm going to have you press pause and then press play again when you are ready to check back in. So what we find when we ask people just to shift their frame of thinking to something that is highly personal and highly specific is they come up with lots of strange ideas that nobody has bothered to think about before. And this leads us directly to one of the most creative inducing techniques that we use in future forecasting, which is a kind of personal foresight practice, where we ask you to project yourself into a future forecast or scenario and keep at the very forefront of your mind 1 or more things that you know a lot about, 1 or more things that you care a lot about, and how you might use that skill or use that passion in the future. And when you have enough people bringing a specific skill or a specific passion to the same forecast or scenario, suddenly you have a lot of different views into that future. You can see it from massively many points of views. And in the next video, I'm going to talk to you about a game that we ran to invite thousands of people to do a first-person future and practice personal foresight using something that they loved or knew how to do all around the same scenario. And I'll tell you how that worked out in the next video. When the future arrives, will you be ready to step up and rise to the occasion? The technique we're going to talk about in this video is designed to help prepare you to make your best and biggest contribution to solving humanity's global problems when that future arrives. I was able to help develop this methodology here at the Institute for the Future over a decade ago. In 2008, we launched a game called Superstruct, and Superstruct really pioneered this method, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the game and how it affected me personally, and then we'll give you a chance to play the game today. So the Superstruct game was a scenario set 10 years in the future, as we do here at the Institute. Actually, it was 11 years. We said it in the year 2019. And the scenario covered 5 different research topics. And we described a world that was very much at risk. In Superstruct, we imagined a supercomputer that was constantly predicting extinction rates for different species on the planet. One day woke up and said, we predict a small possibility of the chance of human extinction based on these 5 different risks or 5 different threats to humanity that, if they all happened at once, could spell extinction. And we deliberately chose a pretty apocalyptic scenario for this particular forecast because we wanted people to be thinking really in a challenging and complex way about what are the biggest problems you could help solve. Many of us feel like in our ordinary lives or our daily work, maybe we're not working on the biggest or most meaningful challenges we face as a planet. So we wanted to create a future forecast where anybody could potentially rise to the occasion and really help humanity. What are the 5 super threats we were looking at? We called them quarantine, ravenous, power struggle, outlaw planet, and generation exile. Quarantine was imagining a pandemic, a disease that was spreading quickly around the globe. Ravenous imagined some pretty severe disruptions to the food supply chain, so people were not able to get enough food to eat in countries all around the world. Power struggle imagined the socioeconomic and political difficulties that certain countries and economies would have evolving out of a fossil fuel economy. Outlaw Planet looked at all of the ways that digital systems and devices could be hacked and the new sorts of crimes and cons we would see. And Generation Exile looked at a world in which we would see hundreds of millions of individuals forced to leave their homes due to climate change and become essentially climate change refugees. We asked players who came to this game to read the forecasts, watch the forecast videos, and pick one of these super threats that they felt most interested in, that they felt called to help solve. And so you've heard about them now. You can see which one you might have picked. Now, I created the game, but I also played it because I always like to play my own games. And so I picked the super threat of quarantine to focus my efforts on. And whatever super threat you picked, you'd consume the forecast, and then we would ask you to imagine on your own and brainstorm with others, what would you do in this future to try to help humanity survive? So imagine in quarantine, there's a terrible new version of a respiratory disease. It doesn't kill you, but it leaves you disabled for the rest of your life if you catch it. What could someone like me do to help this future survive? And here's where we come back to that idea of always having in mind something that you are good at, something you know a lot about, or at the very least you care a lot about, more about than most people you know. In my case, I'm a game designer. That's the idea I always go back to. And so in order to create my first person future here, I needed to think what could I do as a game designer to help in the year 2019 when there's a global pandemic. So I started to think, well, there is a kind of a gamer stereotype that gamers are antisocial people who like to stay at home alone in their basements and play games by themselves. And I realized, well, what is a very good thing for people to do when there's a pandemic? The best thing you can do is stay at home alone in your basement and play games, especially if you're sick and need to be quarantined. You can stay at home. The games will keep you feeling connected to society so that you're more likely to respect the quarantine and actually not put other people's health at risk. And if there's an outbreak in your area and we need you to stay home, we can have some kind of a game that will make you feel like, all right, I'm going to hunker down, bunker down, and it's going to be okay. I don't mind self-quarantining to protect my health. So this was my aha insight that I brought to the foresight, and I started to do some research, because when you start to have ideas for the future, you should always look back to look forward to see if you can find inspiration from the past. I did some research on real pandemics in the past, and I found out that one of the most common vectors for transmission, even when people knew there were really dangerous diseases were dance halls or dance clubs, nightclubs, because there's something so strong about our drive to find people to socialize with and possibly mate with that it overcomes all reason, and we go to these places anyway, even if there's a pandemic. The other place where there continue to be spreads quite often is places of religious worship. That's also a very strong drive. But I decided to focus on dance halls. And I thought, well, maybe I could imagine a game where you can dance at home, alone, by yourself, but be connected virtually to dancers around the world. Then you can have this kind of virtual dance nightclub experience, like Dance Dance Revolution, but massively multiplayer. And that way people won't go to the place where they always go to spread disease. So this was an idea I had in the game, and I actually collaborated with other players. I talked to somebody from our Center for Disease Control who was also playing. We talked about how there might be pushes for people to stay home at play at different times as the rates raised or fell. So we developed this idea a little bit, and that was it, right? That's what futures thinking is. You think about a possible future, you think of what you might do, you tease it out a little bit, and then you just kind of let it simmer, right? And here's the thing. We ran Superstruct, we collected tens of thousands of ideas like this from 10,000 players. And we had this online repository. You can read all these different solutions. It was really fascinating. But then the game ended and we went on with life. But 6 months later, I could not get this weird idea of a stay-at-home dance game out of my head. So I actually decided to build it. So I just went ahead and built an online game, a massively multiplayer dance game called Top Secret Dance Off, where you dance in front of your webcam, and it's a very social experience. And I made this thing, and I invented a scoring system where instead of the game scoring you, because I didn't have any artificial intelligence algorithms that could tell if you were doing a good job dancing in your living room or not, so I let the other players score you, and they handed out +1s for things like +1 coordination or +1 exuberance and imagination and whatever. And it was great. We ran this game, and it was a little experiment, and then it stopped. And then the World Bank called. And they called me, and it was not because they were interested in a Top Secret Dance-Off game, but they were looking for a way to teach social entrepreneurship skills to college age and high school age youth in sub-Saharan Africa. And they had created an online curriculum and nobody was taking it, and somebody said, maybe if you make it a game, people will take it. And so they called me a game designer, and it just so happened that the back end that I built for Top Secret Dance Off was able to be repurposed almost overnight for the World Bank to create what was essentially the world's first massively open online course, just like we take here on Coursera. We created the world's first massively open online course in a game engine, and we enrolled 20,000 students in a class on social entrepreneurship in 10 weeks. And I would not have been able to do that for the World Bank if I had not made this crazy dancing game, which I would not have made if I hadn't been doing personal foresight about a future pandemic that never happened, and that future did not come to pass. But thinking about that future creatively and thinking about what I would do to solve a problem in that possible future led me to prototype and innovate and experiment and have the kinds of ideas that actually allowed me to be creative and invent something new today. That is one of my favorite things about futures thinking, and it's why I'm so excited to be teaching this class here on Coursera, because if there's one thing I know you're going to take away from this specialization is you are going to have strange and creative ideas that are going to simmer in your mind, and it's not going to take 10 years for you to build something interesting or do something amazing with them. And so the activity that I want to leave you with, and hope you will join us as an assignment for, is to think about exactly the same scenario. Imagine there's a pandemic, you've been called to help in some way, using some skill or talent that you have more of than most of the people you know. And I want you to spend even just 15 minutes imagining how you might help humanity in this future, and allow yourself to simmer some strange and amazing ideas, and hopefully they will unfold for you in similarly strange and amazing ways in your own future. In this course, we're really working on improving our mental flexibility, of improving our imagination when it comes to seeing and believing how things could be different. And this technique we're going to learn and practice now is super fun, it's super fast, it's great to do in groups, and it's called 100 Ways Anything Could Be Different. I first learned this technique from Tina Seelig at Stanford University's Design School. This is one of her favorite methods that she uses to help design students and MBA business students think of possible business opportunities, possible startups that they might want to explore. So she uses it in that context. I use it to think about how the future could be different, but it's the same rules, either reason that you're playing. The first thing that you do is you list 100 things that are true about the way something works today. And you really have to try to get to 100. You can use a Google Doc and work together. You can use a big whiteboard or poster and try to write it all together. But you're not done until you come up with 100 things. And this really forces you to list out all of your assumptions about how things work and how reality works, so that you can start hitting back against each of those assumptions one at a time. After you've listed 100 things that are true about something today, and by the way, that something could be what's 100 things that are true about McDonald's, the restaurant chain today. What are 100 things that are true about how we celebrate birthdays today? What are 100 things about how we treat dogs and cats that are our pets today? What's 100 things that are true about earning a college degree today? You could pick anything. So you pick a thing, 100 things that are true about it. And then you pick one of those things and try to make it not true. Describe a version of reality in which that thing would no longer be true. And we're going to walk through an example now, because this is a little bit heady and it'll help to see it done in practice. So let's say we were to pick as a topic marriage. We were trying to list 100 things that are generally true about marriage today. Now, of course, you'll always find exceptions, but generally speaking, what are some things that are true about marriages today? So here are some things that we might say. We might say that marriage generally is between two people. That tends to be true. That most people have one marriage at a time. That marriages are intended to last, even if they don't always last, that we explicitly state that we are entering into them for the rest of our lives. In most parts of the world, marriages are expected to come with some degree of romantic partnership, or at least sexual partnership, that is an assumption. You can choose to marry yourself or have your family help you choose who to marry, but it's not, for example, random who you marry, or you don't outsource it to the government to tell you who to marry. Most marriages start with a wedding, right? That there's some ceremony to mark the beginning of the marriage. And that ending one is a pretty complex legal process, that there are a significant number of obstacles and bureaucracies that you have to go to end your marriage. So those are all things that are true generally for most people about marriage today. What we would do in this future forecasting technique is we would try to imagine a future in which one or more of these things were no longer true. So we might try to imagine a world in which a marriage could be between 3 or more people, that you could have multiple marriages at a time, that a marriage would actually be a short-term partnership that you enter into for specific reasons and expect them to end at a certain time. You might set an expiration date. That there might not be any expectation of romantic or sexual partnership, that there would be marriages that would be quite commonplace that had nothing to do with that. Maybe algorithms would tell you who to marry. We would take the idea of choice out of marriage and we would let an AI decide for us. Maybe weddings would actually become quite uncommon. Maybe it would be more common to celebrate 5 or 10 years into the marriage if you still had a marriage, or maybe you would have a dramatic celebration at the successful conclusion of the marriage, which you had scheduled to end in 20 years or 3 years. And maybe in this future, that ending a marriage would be as simple as tapping an app and declaring it over. Now, can you imagine a future like this? Well, as a reminder, we do so often say here that any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. And in that spirit, I'd love to share with you a video of a future scenario that imagines the future of marriage. And this was created by the students of one of our researchers here, Jake Dunnigan, who you will meet in this lecture series, actually in just a few videos. Jake asked his students to pick a topic they were passionate about. They picked the future of marriage, and they imagined a future in which they flipped and reversed many of these things that are true about marriage today. So you can take a look at this immersive video scenario, and it will really give you a great idea of just how far you can take your foresight and your insight when you believe that at least 100 things could be different from how they are today.
So tell me about yourself.
My mom always used to tell me I was a special girl. She showed me so many old movies. I used to dream of a white sparkling wedding. My first wedding was like that, white dress and all. My other weddings, all of them have been online. I don't really remember them. I'm married to Myra, Shane, and Sia. Since I married Shane, everything has been easier. He and I have a very good business marriage. He also brought a great vibe to the house. It's 6 of us living here. It's really good. Everyone has their different spaces. We really like it. Myra and I only have one biological child out of our network of 5 family units. Our shared son Trey is amazing. We share parenting with them. We don't get to see him that much when he's here. He just fills our lives with joy. So Myra and I, we've been best friends since our teenage years. We decided to get a companionship marriage when we turned 22. After that, she was looking for a mentor and she found someone on a coding forum, and they got married within 4 weeks. I've never met the other person, but I'm sure he's a wonderful person. I knew I wanted to have a brown hair baby with Asian features. Sia and I connected through Blender, and she was looking for a mother profile like mine, and we hit it off right away. She traveled to San Francisco, we met, and we decided to seal the deal. 3 weeks before our wedding, she started taking the pill for her body to produce immature sperm cells, and as soon as we got married, she got knocked up. It was crazy. The great thing about this is I've gotten to select all my partners through shared dynamics, common passions, even necessity. Shane and I had something similar. He and I started our wedding production company years ago, and then the right step was just to get married. After we did it, our finances got the boost that we were expecting. Being together with other 3 people and loving them, it's great. You can share the workload, share your children. Even though, it's not always rainbows and sunshine. It has its ups and downs. Myra and I have been together for 3 years. She lost her job 2 months back. It hasn't been easy. It's very difficult to sustain a marriage with all the taxes I have to pay. I really don't think I can do it anymore. it doesn't make physical sense anymore. We have to move on. We have to be responsible with our other partnerships and commitments. I mean, yeah, it feels lonely sometimes.
Let's try another thought experiment. And this is a warm-up for the next tool that you're going to learn in the next video, because that tool is going to be by far the most complex one that you have encountered so far in this specialization. And I think it'll be really helpful to play with some of the ideas before you have to really apply them in a rigorous way. So the tool you're going to learn is a tool for thinking about alternative futures. And alternative futures means that you can hold in your mind more than one possible way that the future could unfold. And you hold these possibilities in your mind at the same time. And typically in futures thinking, we would try to come up with 4 different possibilities to hold in our mind at the same time. This allows us to stay flexible and open-minded about which path we might actually take. And we're going to warm up for this really complicated and beautiful way of thinking about the future by applying it to our own lives first, because I always find that it's a little bit easier to think about our own futures before we try to figure out, the futures of the whole world. So for this thought experiment, we're going to call this Meet 4 Possible Yous. And I'm going to ask you to consider 4 different paths that your life might take over the next decade. And I will walk you along these 4 paths. So for the first path, I'd like you to consider what you might do over the next decade if you keep going as you are today, pursuing the same goals, caring about the same things, and you're actually getting a little bit better and better all the time. So this is a future that's going well for you, and you stay kind of committed to the path that you're on. Can you imagine what you might have achieved in the next 10 years? Maybe you got a degree, maybe you achieved a work promotion or milestone, maybe you wrote a book. But can you picture future you? What did you do? I think I can imagine myself having taught 1 million people on Coursera. That would be, I would be happy if future me achieved that goal. Okay, that's one possible you. Here comes second possible you. Second possible you has not been so lucky. Second possible you has experienced a really serious setback. This is a future in which everything that could go wrong for you has gone wrong. And you can let your mind go where it wants to. You don't have to picture a tragedy or anything, but what is something you can hold your mind as a possible future that you would definitely like to avoid? Something bad that you can plausibly imagine happening to you that would really throw you off your game and change the course of your life. In my future, having suffered a pretty serious traumatic brain injury in the past, I could imagine if I had another one that would be even harder to recover from. So I'm kind of picturing future me really kind of incapacitated in this future. And I can hold that in my mind too, alongside the other one. Okay, we've met 2 future yous. Let's invite a third one to come and hang out with us. This third person is adaptable, is flexible. This third future you has one really concrete or specific obstacle or change in life that they are adapting to. And they're still trying to live their best life, but they've really had to change things up to adjust to what's going on. So for example, where I live in Northern California, over the past couple of years, we've had a lot of wildfires due to climate change. And this past year, there was terrible smoke in the air for weeks. The skies were almost black. It felt like we were living in a really dystopic future, but it was already happening. And I could imagine future me having to maybe essentially be a climate change refugee a few months out of every year during wildfire season. A lot of people felt like they couldn't live in the Bay Area during the wildfire season anymore. So maybe future me, where I'm like a bird, I go south every fall, I don't know, but that's the kind of change that we're thinking about. So this third version of you, imagine you're flexing, you're adapting to something that's come up in your life and you're trying to solve it as best you can. All right, fourth future you. This is a fun you. This version of you has said, you know what? I'm going for it. I am making the biggest possible change I can imagine for myself. I'm living the life I've always dreamed. I'm taking a leap of faith, and they are just transforming what their life looks like. So maybe it's a big move, maybe it's becoming a parent, maybe it's changing careers, some big change. And this future you just leans wholeheartedly right into it. My future me, number 4, I think I'm moving to China because I think that is going to be a place that is making the future. In the second half of my life, I want to be a part of that. Okay, so you've got 4 future yous and you're holding them all in your mind now as possible trajectories that your life could take. And these 4 possible yous align perfectly with the 4 types of futures that we often try to imagine when we're doing an alternative future forecast. We try to think of one future that we call a growth scenario, where everything kind of heads in the same direction it's going and it's getting a little better and better and better. What does that future look like? And that's like future you number 1. Then we also try to imagine a collapse scenario where everything goes terribly wrong. And that's like the future 2 that you imagined. For future 3, we call that the adapt scenario. And that's where we as a society or community or an organization, we figure out a few key changes we need to make in order to thrive or survive what the future throws at us. And for the 4th future scenario, we call that the transform scenario, where we try to present a possible future that is so different and so strange from what's happening today that it's almost unrecognizable. And this is the really big kind of future that might blindside people if they're not paying attention. So growth, collapse, adapt, and transform. In the next video, you're going to learn how to apply these types of alternative futures, not just to yourself, but to the biggest challenges we face as a society, or the businesses you're trying to build and scale, or any kind of goal you're trying to achieve or topic you're interested in. And since you've applied it to yourself, you are definitely ready to take on that challenge. Good luck.
Hi, my name is Rod Falcon. I'm a research director at the Institute for the Future. And I like to research areas like the future of food, technology, and health. And my favorite thing is actually look at the future of at the intersection of all these different areas. I think that's how you gain the best insight about what's actually changing. I'm here to introduce you to the tool Envision Alternative Futures. Now, this is a tool that's going to allow you to build 4 plausible futures, scenarios, about any topic that you're interested in. Now, I really like this tool because it helps me avoid any blind spots that I might have and forces me to actually build out and consider many different possibilities. Now, when I work with this tool with different groups, it's especially useful when you have someone that's really certain about the future. And it helps you break up that mindset by bringing different futures together and showing them these different possibilities. So let's jump in and I'll show you exactly how to do it. First, pick a topic. The future of medicine, the future of professional football, the future of Buddhism, or even the future of childbirth. Whatever your future of X, put it at the top of the tool. Next, review the 4 scenario archetypes: growth, collapse, constraint, and transformation. Each of these archetypes represents a different way the future could unfold. In a growth future, all the current trends continue. A growth future looks like a bigger, more amplified version of the present. In a constraint future, a new problem or purpose, such as adapting to climate change or addressing runaway economic inequality, becomes a primary factor in how we behave as individuals and organize our lives. Think of this as a kind of reined-in future, where we have more purposeful limits on what we do than in the present. In a collapse future, a catastrophe or disruption of epic proportions means everything breaks down, and we're left to pick up the pieces and survive as best as we can. These aren't necessarily futures anyone wants, but it's important to consider what we might do if they actually happen. And in a transformation future, something massive changes, and something fundamentally different becomes possible. Something as world-changing as the internet or mobile phones, or granting equal political rights to previously disenfranchised groups. This transformation may be the result of a new technology, or a scientific breakthrough, or a new law or social project, or some other huge impact change. A transformative future can often help us imagine a best-case scenario future. Using this tool, you will get to play with all 4 of these archetypes. Now, think of drivers of change that might take your future in different directions. Remember, you're looking for evidence today that the future could be headed in a certain direction. Write your drivers here. For example, one possible driver of a collapse in medicine is that a growing number of antibiotics and antifungals no longer work because the bacteria and fungi have developed resistance. Not sure where to start? You can always do a quick Google search related to your future archetype. Try searching future transformation of football or future growth of Buddhism and see what data you can find. Now you're ready to describe 4 different possible futures, one for each archetype. Write 1 to 3 sentences in each scenario box that finish the sentence, "This is a world in which." For example, this is a world in which videos of the births of babies are commonly live-streamed on the GoBirthMe platform, and strangers watching send virtual gifts and payments to the new parents in celebration. Your goal is to describe 4 very different but all plausible futures depending on which drivers of change ultimately are most influential. 1 growth future, 1 collapse, 1 constraint, and 1 transformation. There's a separate page of tips for how to write good scenarios, so be sure to take a look. Use these 4 alternative scenarios as a starting place for discussion, storytelling, and strategic planning. Which future seems most likely today? Which seems most desirable? Who is likely to benefit and who is likely to suffer more in each future? Which future would take you most by surprise or disrupt your work if it happened? And what can you do to prepare just in case? Feel free to think of as many alternative futures as you want. The more possibilities you can imagine, the more opportunities you can spot and risk you can prepare for. And that's how you envision alternative futures. Hi Max, how you doing?
Good, Rod, how are you?
I'm great. So we're here to talk about the tool Envision Alternative Futures. And so this is a tool that you can really try to explore futures on any topic that you're interested in. So what topic did you bring today?
Today, I brought one of my favorite topics that I've been thinking about, which is the future of cultured meat.
Whoa, that's interesting.
I hope so.
So just for the sake of people watching this, tell us more about just what is cultured meat, because I'm not sure that we would all understand what it is.
Yeah, many people have probably heard either lab-grown meat, Franken meat, fake meat, cell-based meat. We don't really know what to call this yet, but the basic premise is people are growing meat, real meat, not from animal bodies, but instead from animal cells in a medium of nutrients that mimics animal bodies.
They're cultured.
They're cultured, exactly.
All right, so I'm going to write down here the future of cultured meat. That's the topic we're going to explore today using this tool. Now, this sounds like a future you really want to make a reality. Is that right?
I think so. I want to make it a reality, but I want to be very thoughtful and systematic about how it becomes a reality.
Perfect. So that's exactly what this tool is useful for. So oftentimes when we're thinking about different futures, we're really passionate about one future, but to really be disciplined about thinking about the future, we really need to paint many different alternatives, and that's what this tool is going to help us do. Now, I know you're somewhat familiar with the tool and the different scenario archetypes of growth, collapse, constraint, and transformation. So we're going to get to those in a minute, but the way that we often start this tool is to really think about what are the drivers of change that are going to impact each of these, of that area, the future of cultured meat. So have you thought about some drivers that we should jot down?
Yeah, let's think. So when I think about drivers, I normally think in a STEEP type of framework. So when I think of future sort of social drivers, I think about sort of population growth around the world, where there will be more mouths to feed and the demands of those mouths. And it seems like meat consumption is going to increase, is projected to increase, which would set the stage for an investment and sort of research and development in feeding those mouths with meat.
All right, so more growing population, a growing appetite for meat, so more demand. What other drivers do you have?
So technologically speaking, we have a lot of investment in new platforms of synthetic biology and ways of basically culturing cells outside of bodies. And a lot of the technological advancements that are underway right now seem to set up the infrastructure to support cultured meat at scale.
Right. So we have the technology, we know how to do this, and we know how to do it in quantities that will make a significant impact.
Exactly.
Okay.
Maybe just one or two more. Environmentally, of course, we always need environmental drivers, and there's of course, a large link between agricultural production and greenhouse gas emissions. So, depending on who you're asking, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that about 1/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions are resulting from agriculture and land use associated with agriculture. So clearly, we need to reimagine how we grow food, and most of that involves reimagining meat.
So this is a driver where agricultural production and green gases are on the rise. So if we do have a future around cultured meat, so there's a sense, I guess, it would mitigate some of that.
Yeah, that's the hope.
That's the hope. Okay. Any other last drivers before we move forward, thinking about the scenarios?
The global growth of the middle class. So
How's that connected?
Well, it seems to be that middle income consumers have an increased appetite for meat. And so it's not only, we need not only think about sort of population growth across the world, but also the buying power of that population and resulting consumption demands that will.
That's so true. I mean, I think you do see the middle class growing in many different parts of the world, and eating meat oftentimes is a marker of middle class.
Exactly. So it's a cultural symbol that people aspire towards.
Okay. I really like that you used STEEP, so social, technological, economic, environmental, and policy. That's a really good way to organize your drivers. The next step in using this tool then is to think about all of these drivers and how they might shape different scenarios.
Okay.
Okay? So one of the ways that you would do this is to kind of think through, you know what each fundamental archetype means. So the best way to do this is to try to imagine how these drivers would paint a future in which, that's actually the sentence that I want you to think about and try to complete in your mind. So as you think about a growth scenario, try to complete the sentence, this is a future in which, and then try to add some details that really give us a sense of how different that future world is from today.
Okay.
Okay? So I'll give you a minute. You can jot these down and then we can talk about them. So, you want to share them?
Yeah, I will share. These are quick scenarios. So let's start with growth.
Okay.
So when I was thinking about some of the drivers and thinking about a possible growth scenario for cultured meat, I thought that this might be a future in which increased venture capital investment is coupled with a growing growth of the global middle class to drive the consumption of cultured meat around the world. So it's really just a classic sort of business as usual trajectory of we see more investors like Bill Gates and big food and meat companies investing in the space. The technological advances sort of continue along the roadmap that they're projected, and the world starts eating and grows in its consumption of.
So the economy of cultured meat is this growth scenario.
Absolutely.
And certainly you see it in the drivers that you're pointing out, all the investment and the possibility for new markets among a growing middle class. Great. Where do you want to go to next?
Let's go to constraint. So I find constraint scenarios to be very challenging. And one of the elements of some of these alternative futures that I think are often overlooked is the cultural components of these futures. So I tried to think through a constraint scenario that documents a future in which fears around food technology
That's a good one.
and broader sort of desires for natural foods, especially in certain geographies like Europe, limit the consumption of cultured meat through new types of regulatory environments or other types of sort of cultural constraints.
So you're connecting this one with fear and then the possibility of regulation.
Yes, yeah. So, right, fears around these types of food products. And we're already seeing sort of signals of fears around GMOs, fears around automation on farms, culminating in this very possible scenario. In terms of collapse, this to me is a future perhaps in which concerns over lab-grown meat or fake meat or Franken meat, which is again sort of cultural narrative that we're seeing emerge around these new products, is mixed with really high price points for the first type of product on the market. And that might lead towards investment drying up and interest from consumers drying up. So we have this sort of like public media narrative talking about this new type of food in very weird and foreign terms, and then it being probably quite expensive in the beginning.
It's almost like a perfect storm if you don't want to see this future happen.
Right.
Right? So the business model isn't quite there, doesn't get there in time for the market, and the fears come in and it's gone.
Yeah, we acted too soon, or we assumed that too many technologies would be fundamentally developed that haven't, and we missed the mark.
Okay, my favorite. What do you have for transformation?
Oh gosh, my favorite as well, also incredibly challenging. So I was thinking about how meat might be transformed as a sort of a piece of food, as a product, but also as a sort of cultural signifier, and thought about a future in which meat is cultured with personalized nutrients for individual consumers to target specific health needs or concerns that they might have.
Here we go.
So this is a sort of a combination of both cultured meat as a product and larger trends and maybe larger drivers around personalized nutrition and health concerns. And so what would this future look like where we could design meat products specifically for Rod and specifically for Max, which animal bodies are somewhat limited in being able to
So you're thinking
produce.
about taste, or are you thinking about meat for diabetics?
Yeah, that's so interesting. But maybe both, right? I think taste, certainly, mouthfeel, but also really like fortifying different types of foods with different types of nutrients based on your profile and the nutrients that you need and the other foods that you might be eating throughout the day. So this might be a really big, interestingly enough, like a growth scenario for cultured meat, but one in which cultured meat is transformed through some of these other broader drivers.
Great job.
Thanks.
Yeah, this is really, really, really cool. So, when you're working with a tool like this, and you actually just did, you're now really at a point where you could use this to actually provoke even more conversation with the network of people that are trying to make this future happen. This is a really good place to even go deeper on the storytelling. And depending on what role you're playing, you can even start to clarify, what role would I play in any one of these futures? Or maybe across all four. But I'm curious, which of these scenarios do you really, really like?
Do I really, really like?
Yeah.
Okay, the biased Max really, really likes the growth scenario, quite frankly, which is one that suggests that we will have widespread, very scalable, cheap cultured meat around the world.
I mean, that feels really plausible, even in my view. It feels like technology, investment, the demand possibly is there.
I actually think it's the narrative around cultured meat makes us assume that it's highly plausible. I actually think it's one of the least plausible of the scenarios, only because I think that type of scenario of just growth of this technology kind of overlooks a lot of the really serious regulatory challenges, consumer perception challenges, and some of the serious technological barriers that still exist to produce meat at scale to be competitive in the market. So this is, I think, a wild future and one that I'm most interested and hopeful for.
And what about, just another question, really for you and other people working in this area?
Yeah.
Which is the scenario that's most surprising? That would really, take someone that's working in the area of cultured meat and it's like, whoa, I didn't even consider that.
I mean, in my mind, I guess the collapse scenario would be the most surprising because the people who work in this space are
believers.
Maybe perhaps too optimistic. They're believers. And what I actually really like, yes, as someone who's a quote-unquote believer, I like that this tool has forced me to imagine the collapse scenario in a very real way, which maybe I would think in my mind I've thought of or consider, but I don't seriously try to paint the picture about what might drive the collapse. And then if I really don't want that collapse scenario, what could I do or what could other stakeholders in the space do to ensure that that future doesn't come to fruition?
Well, I think you really demonstrated how to use this tool in a really great way. So I want to thank you for that. But as you dig deeper into this tool, there are a lot of pointers and a lot of different ways that the tool actually shows you how to go even deeper and how to use this even more. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Rod.
So you've seen how it's done. Pretty easy, pretty quick. Max was a great person to model this. You can download the tool and actually do it yourself. You'll find that there are a lot of resources, and soon you too will be exploring many different alternatives of the future.
Now that you know how to use the Alternative Futures tool, I thought it would be really interesting for you to see one way that we use the tool here at the Institute for the Future in a project that we did on the future of caregiving. This was a project we did in collaboration with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and we were trying to imagine different possible futures for how we might care for the elderly or for people who are disabled or sick in the future, and how we might all care for each other more. So you're about to see 3 different alternative futures that we imagined. Enjoy.
I really like my new job as a customer service manager at our local food co-op. The work is demanding but rewarding. Of course, managing my family as well as my job is a challenge. I have 2 active kids who need me to stay on top of their needs and schedules, even when I'm at work. One big help has been Oscar, our family's digital assistant, who keeps tabs on us so we can stay organized and connected. He schedules our medical appointments, pays our bills, even helps plan our meals and family outings. But this year I've learned what my mom meant when she talked about being in the sandwich generation when she raised me and took care of her parents. Since my dad passed away last year, she's been living on her own, and her Parkinson's disease is making it harder for her to take care of herself. I see her as often as I can, but she's over an hour away, so we've been experimenting with new technologies to help fill the gaps. Fortunately, my dad had installed a bunch of smart systems in their home to automate things like security and energy management. Their system even orders groceries to be automatically delivered to the house. When he passed away, we added a new module that keeps track of my mom's health and her activities. At first, the system was buggy and kept sending out false alarms. But after a bunch of tweaking and a lot of frustration, it seems to be more reliable now. There have been other small technologies that have helped, like the stabilizing utensils that help with her trimmers, but the most useful gadget has been Cleo, our telepresence robot. Mom was skeptical about having a robot in her house, but she soon discovered that she could use Cleo to visit with friends who lived in other cities. She also likes the fact that she can use it to visit with her grandkids almost every night. The next upgrade will be to add arms to Cleo to help Mom in and out of the bed and bath. All this technology isn't cheap, but it's less expensive than hiring a full-time caregiver or moving Mom into an assisted living facility. We even found a pharmaceutical company that partially covers the cost in exchange for access to her health data. I really appreciated the value of having all this stuff at 6 o'clock this morning. I got an alert from my mom's medical monitor that she seemed to be having a bad reaction to one of her new meds. I checked on her using Cleo, and she seemed very groggy, so I asked Oscar to send a message right away to her healthcare team. In a few minutes, we were able to set up a 3-way call, and her care team coordinator did a quick assessment and changed the dosage for the drug. After work, I'll go over to the house to check on her in person, but I was relieved that I didn't have to barrel down there in my pajamas first thing in the morning. By the time I got to Mom's house, she seemed to be better, but I discovered a new problem. She's kept an active life online, and even though I've warned her about online scams, she was worried about an urgent message that her home monitoring system was vulnerable to attack, which she needed to pay $1,000 to upgrade. With Oscar's help, I was able to report the scammer and update the security settings to prevent it happening again. Now I just need to figure out why the thermostat in Mom's house insists on keeping the temperature at 90 degrees. You know, sometimes it seems like managing the technology is a whole new set of caregiving responsibilities. I do worry about my in-laws in the country who are getting older and don't have access to all of this tech, but hopefully I won't have to deal with their needs for a few more years.
When Grandpa suffered a stroke last year that left him partially paralyzed, we immediately realized that someone was going to have to take care of him when he came back from the hospital. Since everyone else in the family was working full-time, and I was just a student, I got the job. The problem was that I had no idea how to take care of someone who had had a stroke. To make things more complicated, he also had been dealing with diabetes for many years. Now, there was a lot he wasn't able to do for himself, so I needed to learn a whole bunch of new stuff. The medical group that manages my grandpa's health offered to train me to be a certified caregiver, and even offered to pay me a stipend to help cover my training and my caregiving time. I found out that this new role was created in 2026 when Congress passed the CARER Act. Not only did the act let me get paid for caregiving once I was certified, but it also mandated that I could get medical care for physical or mental conditions related to being a caregiver. So I've been taking a bunch of technical caregiving classes in addition to my normal college course load. The support I got was really important at first, but now that I've had a year of on-the-job training, all of the required courses and certification exams can be more of a distraction than a help to me. Still, I can imagine how much harder it was for caregivers in the past. It blows my mind that in 2016, nearly half of all caregivers said that they had to perform complex medical care with almost no training or support, and without any compensation. And if I wasn't getting a stipend, there's no way I could have stayed in school through all this. The peer-to-peer learning module that I took on dehydration symptoms and treatment has already come in handy at least twice, and my grandpa's medical team knows it. At our monthly care meetings, it was acknowledged that the steps I took after spotting early signs of dehydration directly contributed to avoiding a hospital admission. One of the doctors told me about a new study that showed that hospital readmissions of frail elders have been reduced as a result of better support from certified caregivers just like me. Now, I just have to finish studying for my final exams for my spring college classes, upload the report on my week's caregiving activities, and take care of Grandpa. I worry about getting burned out by all of this. Maybe I can arrange for a day of respite care, another benefit of the CARER Act, which would give me a chance to chill out with a couple of my friends, if they're still around.
If I had children today, I'm sure I would love them like crazy, but I'm also pretty sure I wouldn't have enjoyed my life as much. I have great friends, strong ties to my neighbors and my community, and before I retired 10 years ago, steady work. I suppose, too, that if I had children, I might be making different plans for the next few years of my life, since I learned that the melanoma that was successfully treated 10 years ago has returned and metastasized. Even after all the efforts to find cures for cancer, the survival rate for my specific metastatic cancer has barely budged from 10%. Aggressive treatment would probably buy me little in terms of time, and the quality of my life would suffer. So I have some serious planning to do for my care. My friends and I who went through the stressful and exhausting experience of taking care of our parents vowed not to put the same burden on our loved ones. The challenge was even greater for those of us without children or close family members. Some of us got serious about creating community care networks so that we'd be able to rely on each other for the things children used to do for their ailing parents. We created a care bank that let members like me accumulate credits for time spent volunteering to help other members. It's reassuring to see that I have a built-up decent positive credit that I can call on for the support I'm going to soon need. Of course, my care bank credits will only go so far. When I was first diagnosed with melanoma 10 years ago, I was able to rely on the care gig economy to hire people to help me with daily tasks like meal prepping, house cleaning, and trips to the doctor. I expect that I'll be making use of these resources again. And to help pay for these services, I'm going to start using the rider that my life insurance policy offers. It's called an accelerated care benefit, and it will allow me to spend down my death benefit to pay for care services. I certainly want to allocate money from my life insurance policy to close friends and a few organizations I admire, but without any direct dependence, it makes sense for me to use some of that money when I need it to help make my life more comfortable while I'm still alive. And while I'm grateful for these care platforms, I know from experience that not even the closest friend or most skilled gig worker can take the role of a devoted family caregiver in the final days. So I signed an advanced caregiving directive because I don't want my friends to be on the hook to determine when I need more formal assistance. The directive spells out the level and kind of care I want to receive and when I should transition into a long-term facility. I hope that my wishes will be respected. Finally, I'm glad that even my friends who don't have care bank credits or care riders, or life insurance for that matter, have some level of support thanks to the recently passed catastrophic long-term care program. I firmly believe that it was us, the almost half of Americans who find ourselves not married and without children, that forced the hand of the federal government to finally pass the legislation behind this program. It's not a perfect solution, but at least it's a first step in recognizing that we can't depend on the traditional family to meet everyone's caregiving needs.
So far in this course, we've been focused on how simulation happens in your brain, because your brain, after all, is the ultimate virtual reality simulating machine. But for this final week of the course, we're going to zoom out and take a look at how some emerging technologies are changing how we simulate the future. Everything from artificial intelligence to virtual reality. And I'm really excited to turn things over to some of my colleagues here at the Institute for the Future to take you on a tour of some advanced simulation topics. And I will see you at the end of the week.
Hi, my name is Toshi Anders Hu. I'm the director of the Emerging Media Lab here at Institute for the Future. We're really looking at the future of communication and collaboration. I've spent the last 25 years of my career thinking very deeply about how the new forms of media and communication technologies are going to affect us in all walks of life. I think part of why I'm interested specifically in communication technology is, in some ways, our communication technologies are the enabling technologies for all other innovation and changes in our society. Of course, in our lifetimes that we've seen in the last couple decades, we've had the internet enter into our life, and that's been a dramatic change in society. 25 years ago, the world was a very different place. So in the Emerging Media Lab, we not only do foresight work and research reports, but we're also interested in prototyping. We're looking into a whole new different paradigm of media as we shift away from the really powerful abstract representational media systems of print and video and now the internet to what we call experiential media. which includes things like virtual reality and augmented reality, where we're going to be stepping inside our computers, into our data, into simulations. Or with augmented reality, we're going to be laying our data and our computing interfaces right on the world. So one of the experiments or prototypes that we've been working on in the Emerging Media Lab is creating an immersive storytelling platform for Institute for the Future to be able to share our scenarios of the future and allow people not only to look at or hear about these future scenarios, but actually step inside of them using VR technology. So with that in mind, we've created an immersive storytelling platform called Simtainer.
Welcome to Simtainer, an immersive journey developed by the Emerging Media Lab at the Institute for the Future.
And Simtainer uses a VR system to allow folks to put on a VR headset and literally step inside some of these forecasts and scenarios that we've created. The first thing you experience is you're inside of a virtual shipping container. And we're looking at this idea of shipping container. We're using that as a metaphor for the idea that basically VR is going to change our sense of presence. In the same way, shipping containers allows us to globalize the world by moving goods and things throughout the world, and the way the internet has basically globalized the world by allowing us to move information. We're about to be able to move our presence throughout the world, both geographically, but we're going to be able to move through different scales of time and space, be able to travel through time in VR. So of course we can go into the past, but we're very interested in also allowing people to step into future scenarios. So when you step into Simtainer, you put on the headset, you put on the headphones, you're inside a virtual shipping container. You'll hear a voiceover explain to you what the project's about, a little bit about Institute for the Future, and then we ask you to close your eyes. And when you open your eyes again, suddenly you're not in a shipping container anymore. You're actually in a micro clinic, a mini hospital inside of a shipping container.
Open your eyes. This high-tech medical clinic was built inside a shipping container the same size as the one you began in.
We do a small story about that. We ask you to close your eyes again. You open your eyes again. At that point, you're inside a little micro home, a micro apartment. And then the final scene, we take you to a micro farm, like a shipping container farm where people are growing lettuce, and you're actually able to go and harvest some of that lettuce. We created this as an experiment. We were very interested in understanding what are the tools required to create a VR experience, what are the ways that you can tell stories inside those kinds of experiences. One of the interesting experiments that we included in our Simtainer, first version of our Simtainer platform, was a mixed reality element. Now, mixed reality is when you have a virtual reality experience, but you integrate physical objects or experiences into that experience so that you have an embodied haptic, a sense of touch experience with that. So when you enter into the micro clinic, we actually at the end of that scene invite you to sit down on a chair. Now, you're in VR, you're looking down at a virtual chair, and we've actually placed a physical chair matching up to that virtual chair. So as you sit down in that virtual world, you're actually sitting down in a real chair. Now, that's a really powerful experience because even though you know you're consciously being tricked by a simulation, when your body sits down to that chair, you have a real sense that that world is real. So we first created Simtainer as an exhibit for one of our conferences to help people understand not only what the future of VR was, but how they might think about what the future of new modular architecture. How could shipping containers, one of the most prevalent architectural forms in the world, be used in new ways? So we presented this at our internal conference, but it was so successful and we got such great feedback, we've then got invited to present this all around the world. We've taken it to China and to the Middle East and to Canada, and I'm most excited about our invitation. We were invited to bring Simtainer to the United Nations General Assembly in New York City. And of course it was exciting to present our work, but what was really exciting there wasn't just that we were bringing an exhibit, but that we were bringing an exhibit that really helped the folks, the world leaders and all the delegates that were at the General Assembly think about what it would be actually like to step into these futures. Often the future is very difficult to imagine and discuss because it doesn't exist yet. And we have a lot of methodologies and tools for trying to describe the future and explore those possible futures. But a lot of it is very abstract. And so to create an experience that really makes that even though it's virtual, more of a reality and something that you feel that you've stepped into, was a very, very powerful, not only demonstration itself, but it was a way to kind of allow people to imagine how we might use these new types of tools for futures thinking itself. And in a place like the United Nations, they're often dealing with very difficult, big problems. And the solutions often take, often the solutions that they're looking at require very different ways of looking at the world and possibilities that don't exist yet and might even seem quite outlandish. And of course, as we know, in futures work, often the things that are actually, that seem very unreasonable or improbable come to pass often. The things that seem improbable or often become inevitable eventually. So how do we convey those and even design and iterate on those? Virtual reality is going to be one of the platforms that's going to allow us to really explore that. We're very excited for folks all around the world to get more access to creating immersive experiences to help communicate our ideas about futures thinking and our future scenarios that we're imagining, and to be able to create those together, to be able to share those and explore them together.
I'm Lonnie Avi Brooks, and I'm an associate professor in communication at Cal State East Bay. And for me, the future is really personal. I grew up with Star Trek posters on my wall, from the 1970s and on. I just fell in love with the future. In fact, I was also born partially blind. So for me, the future is really personal in that technology like computing helped me to see into the world better. It augmented my reality, literally. Right now, Afrofuturism is a major topic of what I do in terms of forecasting. Bringing the Afrocentric perspective to forecasting is a central task of mine. Afrofuturism was a term that was coined in 1990 by Mark Derry, a cultural critic. Black people have always been futurists. The Black diaspora was captured from their alien planet in West Africa, taken with the latest in bondage technologies, and transported across a vast ocean to a new world where they had to innovate around an unfamiliar and alien landscape. They were killed if they spoke their own languages or practiced their own rituals. And so they had to innovate. They had to infuse whatever alien religions were given to them with new ideas, ancient rituals, under the radar. Just seeing so many artists, creators, thinkers, technologists talking about the future from an Afrocentric perspective really means a lot to me. We have the science fiction writers of N.K. Jemisin and Nnedi Okorafor and Octavia Butler, Samuel Delany, that have brought these dimensions alive. We have Sun Ra from the jazz of the 1940s. We have George Clinton, Funkadelic, and Fear of a Black Planet. And all these are signals about what we can take from an Afrofuturism perspective. The idea of seeing more, having a wider aperture, seeing beyond binaries. Now it's become more mainstream too with the event of the Black Panther. So seeing the Black Panther and this fictional uncolonized nation of Wakanda was amazing. Just having my daughter see herself reflected in a technologist like Shuri, the sister of King T'Challa, was amazing. And it's about really seeing more in the varieties of cultural imaginations that are out there. So I share a dream that forecasting includes and shares a variety of cultural imaginations, and that they are reflected in the forecasting of today. What I've learned from the Institute for the Future is to tell a good story, to identify signals that are coming now that will anticipate the future. And so now I look around me and I see the signals popping out. And this is what I teach my students. And then we weave scenarios around them and tell stories about them so that in a page and a half, they can tell a pretty good story. What the Institute for the Future has given me is the license to be free with your imagination, anchored 10 foot deep or 10 feet deep in reality, as Maurice Sendak says, and I got that from Jane McGonigal. Thank you, Jane. You have futures that are anchored in signals and that can arise into the imagination. And to give people license to express their imagination is the best gift you can give anyone in the world.
This is one of the techniques that we use in futures work to try to help people understand the future in a deeper way, really to feel it, not just to think about it. How do you create those experiences? How do you create those artifacts from the future that make that abstract world concrete in some direct way and feelable and an experience of that? Well, the way we do that, one way that we do that is using something called the Experiential Futures Ladder. Now, this is a step-by-step process to go from a big idea, a big abstract concept about what you want to communicate, down into the actual stuff that you build. This method was pioneered by Stuart Candy, a design futurist at Carnegie Mellon, and he and I have developed it through workshops and classes and writing over the years. And we have a fairly straightforward step-by-step system that understands, that goes from the abstract to the concrete to help you think about how you design a futures experience or artifact, and what do you need to think about in what order. So the Experiential Futures Ladder has 4 main parts, and they go from, if you think about them going down and being nested and getting more specific and more concrete, they go from the abstract down into the concrete. So a big idea, a big topic, starting, and then down into the actual experience and the stuff that you build. So those 4 steps are: 1, the setting. That is the high level topic, and it could be, you know, it could be an abstract artifact, an abstract archetype, like a growth future in 2040 or a collapsing world. But it also could be a little bit more topical, like the future of water or New York City in 2050. And so that's your top level setting. The next level down is taking this big world, of which there could be, you know, infinite numbers of ways to tell that story, and to begin to put some stakes in the ground through a scenario, through a expressed narrative of one of those possible worlds. So New York in 2050, there's a billion different ways that could happen. What is the way that happens in your world? Create a world. This is a world building exercise so that we know which New York in 2050 are we trying to deal with. So writing a scenario, using some of the lessons that you've had before about trend analysis and signals and creating this forecast, using those as a foundation to build a very robust understanding and a very robust story about your world. Okay, next level down, you've got setting, big story, New York 2050, using that example. Big setting, a story, what's happening there. Okay, this is a playground for the rich in this New York. You know, it's basically sanitized, and it really is not for every people. It's really kind of a playground for the super rich. So that's your world of New York. And then what is the situation? That's the next level down, the third part of this. So setting, story or scenario, and situation. This is where we go into more of a concrete one-to-one representation of what it might be like to live there. So even with a scenario, you can't create an experience that you show everything that could happen in that world. So you need to create a vignette, a story, a moment, an artifact that communicates that in some real way, some effective way. And that's to me, that is the real crux of the value that Experiential Futures does, is going from that world and really filtering it down into a situation that embodies the aspects of that world in some compelling way. If you're an archaeologist, right, you find an artifact, you look at it, you try to understand the culture and civilization that existed to make that artifact possible. The same way that we're kind of artificially creating artifacts and creating situations is to help people try to feel what it's like, try to understand the context. Why does that thing exist in this world? And to understand that. So the situation is a moment in time, a ritual, an interaction, something that you can produce that helps people understand that broader world that you're talking about. So in this playground for the rich, Manhattan in New York, is this a dinner scene? Is it a wedding? Is it riding some kind of subway, if its subway exists? What are the moments that might tell you this is what it's like to live in that world? And this is the creative process. So you have the futures work that you've done to give you that foundation, but now you have to take a leap and to try to evoke that world effectively. So you have your situation, you go through that, and then the final piece of this, and most concrete, is the stuff, right? So these are the things that would, if you're in a restaurant, you know, what are the tables? Are there people serving others? What are the utensils that are being used? All of those things that exist in that scene that you need to create to help people imagine what it's like to live in that world and to understand the interactions that are going on. So all of this is in service of a deeper understanding of a future, and using a way of talking and a way of communicating and a way of feeling that's different from a written piece or a presentation of some sort. This is really trying to embody those futures in some tangible way. Let's go through an example of what this looks like in practice. And I'm going to use a project that I worked on a few years ago for the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities. And I was brought into the city of Newport, Rhode Island as a catalyst in residence to try to help people think about the future, the people in Newport, a public conversation really to inspire and provoke them to think about their futures in more interesting, deep, provocative ways and to expand their horizons. So I came in to do that, and I wanted to do an experiential future. I wanted them to feel what a different Newport might be like in the future. So the setting for me was Newport, Rhode Island, right? That was sort of given by the confines of the project and the scope of the project. But we discussed, you know, some other parts of the setting. So it's Newport, but what year? So we decided on the year 2061, which was roughly 2 generations into the future. It also was a reversal of 2016, so 1661, that gives us some time. And it's far enough out for people to really not be so concerned with what's going on in the everyday surroundings of the present of that time at 2016. So high level setting, in this case, using the ladder, if we think about that, Newport, Rhode Island, 2061. The next step was really to create a scenario. So out of all the possible Newport, Rhode Island in 2061, what actually happens in our world that we're going to represent? And so through interviews, research, surveys that we did, site locations, me and the team of sponsors there wrote a story about the future of Newport, a scenario that provided some structure to the thinking about what's really going on. So it's a longish kind of scenario, and you don't have to have a very long scenario. It could be a couple of paragraphs. It could be long. It could be several thousand words. But it's really just enough to give you an understanding of how the world works, and for that scenario to be internally consistent, to be understandable, to be logical within the confines of that world. So in our Newport of 2061, we had, of course, some climate change issues. It's on the coast. It's being buffeted by different weather systems, and it's sort of constantly under threat in that way. Another interesting thing that happened between 2016 and 2061 was that an artificial intelligence had become mayor of the town. So this artificial intelligence was elected by the people. It was a legal person through the eyes of the law, so it was elected. It was doing a great job, according to most, but it began to do some weird things working with other AIs, and ultimately did some illegal activities. And so a case was brought to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of the United States said, you know what, we're not going to allow any artificial being to hold office. And so in this case, in 2061, a human mayor had been back in place in Newport. The 2 states had seceded, Texas and Hawaii, from the U.S. So all of these things provide the backbone for understanding of what we're trying to do and the kind of world we're building out in Newport. So that's the scenario, the story. Third layer down is the situation. And again, we were trying to say what could evoke reactions, provoke people to think about their possible futures in a more interesting way, a deeper way, maybe an unusual way, to really break the habits of thinking that people had tended to have there in the city. So one of the things that we latched onto, you know, part of the story involved the mayor and the artificial intelligence as mayor. So we said, what if we created a mayor's office from the year 2061? So a mayor's office really kind of condenses symbolically a lot of the aspects of a city, right? So what's hanging on the walls, or what papers are on the desk, or is there a desk? What's happening? What are the kind of decisions that are being made? All of those things have a great symbolic value, and they can communicate a lot of meaning very quickly. And people really, they understand, okay, I'm walking into a mayor's office. I can read that room in a certain way. So we created a mayor's office of the future, and then we needed to populate it, right? So we needed to create, okay, what's happening in this world? So in this case, the floor had to be raised 3 feet because of frequent tides coming in the office, the mayor's office. We actually used an old abandoned gas station, which happened to be right in the middle of town. It also happened to be right where the original spring, the water spring was from the town. So it had a lot of symbolic historical value as well. And so we used that as our palette for telling this story about Newport in the future. And people could come in and experience that world, walk through, look at all of the artifacts that were on the desk and on the wall, see a 48-star flag instead of a 50-star flag, look at the signing of the Newport Compromise, which saved the other 48 states as part of the Union. All of these little bits of the story collectively can be read as people walk through and experience that. And so that's how we, just as an example, how we went from a big abstract idea, Newport, Rhode Island, 2061. How do we do something meaningful with that? Okay, let's tell a story about a climate reaction, new technologies, a fracturing of the United States, and have that be our backdrop for this story about this new mayor, a human mayor that was in office, and what's her life like, and what does she have around her. One of my favorite artifacts from that that we created with artists and students in town, so it was very much a collaborative experience, was a signed photo from the winner of the Newport to North Pole yacht race. So instead of beating people over the head saying, you know what, the North Pole ice caps are melted, we created this image so people could infer that from that artifact. So the room all tells a story in a different way, or a different piece of the story. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to give people handles on what's happening in this world, and how do they react to it, and how might it feel to live in that world. And so doing that kind of immersive experience is very useful for helping people understand that, rather than if they just read the scenario, which a lot of people did. That's a different experience. It's a valuable experience, but I think a less valuable experience than really putting yourself in that and feeling it in your bones and your guts. So hopefully you understand the process, or the cognitive architecture that we're building, moving from an abstract idea and carefully going through each stage, where each part of this experience that you're creating is embedded in the work you did on the previous section. So from setting to scenario to a situation to the stuff that you build. But I also want to provide some design principles. So if you're creating the stuff that's around you, or you're creating the experience, what are some of the ways that you do it most effectively? Right? How do you actually connect with people? Maybe you've got a good story, maybe you thought of a good situation, but what are some of the ideas of when you're actually designing the pieces, the tangible media and the experiences? What are some things to think about as you're doing that? Now this is very much a practical practitioner's kind of set of principles, really when you're actually doing the designs. So I like to think about four different design principles that I like to keep in mind as I'm doing these designs. One is we say, don't break the universe. And I'll explain that. The second we call a snake dog leash, and I'll explain that one as well. The third is future jamming. And the last one we call 550, 500. And so let's go through each one of these. So don't break the universe, right? I mentioned at the beginning that people have a lot of psychological tools to dismiss futures that they don't understand, or they don't like, or they don't think are relevant. So when we say don't break the universe, we try not to give people an out. We try to make it as coherent, as logical, as full-bodied as we can, and not to say, hey, you know what, this is the future. So to have them take it seriously, even for a split second, that often creates an emotional connection, a visceral connection, that if they just said, oh, well, that's some future thing, I don't really have to pay attention to it. So if it holds together as a coherent story within the world or within the space that you're building, that really has an extremely profound effect on people. Again, you're not trying to fool them to make them feel dumb or to feel like they've missed something. You're really trying to have them take it seriously. And then you pull back the curtain and say, okay, now what was that like? What did you think? How did that feel versus what you expected to happen? So don't break the universe, one of our key design principles. Second is one very practical, we call the snake dog leash. It may not sound practical, but it is. So this is the idea that, okay, you're building a future experience. You have limited time, you have limited budget, you may have limited space. You can't, also just from the bounds of physics or reality, if I'm doing a very high-tech future, I can't create a teleportation machine, right? So I can't actually make those things happen, but I have to make people feel like it exists. So the idea of providing people with a little bit of a tip of the iceberg understanding of what that technology is or how we respond to it is one of our core techniques. And we call it the snake dog leash. This was an idea invented by the designer Matt Jensen, who we worked with on many projects. And it's the idea that, okay, I can't engineer a snake dog, right? I can't combine the genes to make something that's a hybrid of a snake and a dog. But if I put a snake dog leash on a shelf and say, snake dog leash, $7, you can infer the rest of the world around that. You can infer that something like called a snake dog exists. And so for that little hack that we do as far as a design tells that world in a very rich way, and it communicates the kind of meaning and understanding of the world that we're trying to do. Very practical from constraints of doing the design, but also I think very effective for the imagination to engage a participant or an audience member or someone in a workshop in thinking through that and to filling in the gaps that may exist and to filling in the world in a richer way. The third one we call future jamming. This is kind of a take on the idea of culture jamming from Adbusters, but it's basically to take the vessels that exist today, advertisement, other media, things on the street, signage, what exists today that you could smuggle in some futures content. It could be a tourism poster for a trip to Mars. It could be a pack of cigarettes that instead of giving you cancer, they scrub your lungs with nanoparticles and make you actually healthier. So you can be very creative in this space and use the media and use the expectations that people have and subvert them in very effective, sometimes humorous, but often very edifying ways. And finally, the last design principle that we think about is 5-50-500, which is just a short way of saying or a way of visualizing the engagement that people can give, the attention that people have to provide to engage with the work that you're doing. So 5 seconds, 50 minutes, 500 minutes, or 500 hours, right? It's based on the pyramid of participation concept that says the vast majority of socially produced content, like Wikipedia is a prime example, is done by a very small number of people. So they're the heavy hitters and they're doing the bulk of the work. There's another subset, maybe 8 to 10%, that are editing, adding some references, maybe doing some proofreading and adding a bit here or there, not really doing the heavy lifting, but helping out. And then the vast majority, maybe up to 90%, are really just reading. They're kind of passive and engaging with that. So if somebody has 5 seconds to look at a design you're doing, they should be able to get something out of that. Oh, cancer scrubbing cigarettes. If somebody wants to spend 50 minutes with it, looking at all the details, looking at some of the warnings that are different or unusual or interesting, going to maybe a website that you created in the background for this company, that's the 500-minute level version of that. So as best you can, and it's not possible in all cases, you really want to try to design your experiences where if someone only has a glance or a moment, they get something out of it. But if somebody really wants to go and research everything that you've done, you've also got that material there as well. It's a lot of work, but the payoff can be extremely effective. So just to wrap up, we need to tune our neurons. We need to pre-experience the future so that we can understand it in a deeper, different way, to understand it with our full bodies and minds. And there are a host of techniques that we have learned over the years, again, leveraging some of our insights from neuroscience and cognitive science and psychology, but also from design and performance. How do you make people feel something? How do you make people feel something that doesn't exist? And we marshal all of those forces, all of that research, all of those processes, all those concepts to bring together into an experience and hopefully change people's minds.
Congratulations, you have reached the end of simulation skills. You have leveled up your foresight and future thinking skills in so many ways. You have learned the magic triangle of simulation, how to predict the past, remember the future, and use your hard empathy. You have practiced first-person futures thinking and built empathy for your future self. You know how you can make anything 100 ways different in the future. You have gotten more of an understanding of how AI and VR can change how we simulate the future. You are ready now for the ultimate collaborative experience in futures thinking. That is course number 4 in this specialization. If you are ready to learn all about gaming and how we can increase our collective intelligence about the future and our collective imagination about the future, then you are ready for the next course. You are ready to play. I will see you in Collaborative Foresight, How to Game the Future.